In our first session on June 24th, we heard from our panelists and Commissioner Tani of Oregon that the risk of wildfires has created financial impacts for all electric utilities across the country, not just in the West, in terms of availability and cost of capital, as well as availability and cost of insurance. This impacts the affordability of electric utility operations, resulting in increased costs for customers, and hampers the ability for utilities to pursue new generation capacity and system upgrades to meet new demand, resource adequacy needs, and clean energy goals and requirements. In the second session held on August 8th, we heard from experts from Stanford University, California's Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, and the Pacific Northwest National Lab about mitigation strategies and risk modeling that electric utilities and state commissions can adopt to reduce the risk of wildfires, how these strategies may help reduce risk and reduce the financial impact to electric utilities and utility customers. Today, in our last session, we're going to discuss comprehensive policy solutions that, together with the strategies we've discussed during the last two sessions, can address and reduce the affordability and financial impacts of wildfire risk. So thank you again to Jody Rains, our Senior Cybersecurity Policy Specialist from NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and Lynn Constantini, Deputy Director of NARUC CPI, for organizing and supporting this effort. And thanks to all of you who signed up to participate in this session and for your interest. Commissioner Fay of Florida, Chair of NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee, and Commissioner Tani of Oregon, and I will lead today's session, although we recognize Commissioner Fay may need to jump off to address the events coming to Florida. The format for this session will include an hour of presentation on this topic, and then we're reserving the second hour for discussion among commissioners, staff, and NARUC members in moderated breakout sessions, as well as having a reconvening discussion at the end. So we encourage all state commissioners and staff, whether you're in the West or not, to stay for this discussion, as it is relevant not only for Western states. And while this is the last of our 3 regulator roundtable sessions, NARUC has more planned to address wildfires. At the NARUC annual meeting in Anaheim, there'll be a general session on Tuesday afternoon, November 12th, addressing the financial impacts of wildfire, and then a workshop from 3 to 5 following the general session. At the workshop, we plan to present a report out from the 3 sessions, as well as begin work on developing a handbook for state regulators about how to approach wildfire risks and financial impacts. The workshop will build on the work from these 3 sessions and work to scope the topics and issues for the handbook. The workshop is open to all and will include all industries, including telecommunications, water and gas utilities, recognizing, as with all natural disasters, that all critical infrastructure is impacted. So stay tuned for more details, but please go ahead and register for the annual NARUC meeting and for the workshop through the agenda for the annual meeting on the NARUC website. And now turning to today's session, we're going to hear from a fantastic panel of speakers. We have with us Caroline Thomas Jacobs, Director of the California Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, who's going to discuss California's model for a state wildfire fund and limitation on electric utility liability. Michael Wara, Senior Research Scholar at Stanford University's Woods Institute for the Environment, who will address a proposal for a federal framework modeled on the California system to address financial risk to utilities and address affordability and availability of insurance. And then Riaz Mohammed, a Wildfire Regulatory Policy Specialist with Xcel Energy. Riaz is formerly with EEI and for the last 6 years led internal and external engagement on wildfire issues, including work with the Electric Sector Coordinating Council's Wildfire Working Group. After these presentations, Commissioner Tani and Commissioner Fay will pose several questions to the panelists, and at the top of the hour, our panelists and participants who are not commissioners or staff will leave the Zoom call and we'll begin a more focused session. I'll let you know that we are recording this, and so the first hour will be available for commissioners and staff and possibly outside folks to view. So we're working on that and hope to post these on the NARUC website. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and we'll begin with Caroline Thomas Jacobs. So please take it away, Caroline.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and chat with everyone. So I know that at the prior session that you guys had, my general counsel talked a lot about the wildfire mitigation plans and the requirements. So what I'm going to talk about today is, as Commissioner Rendall said, was the wildfire fund that was created as part of the new novel regulatory scheme that California passed in response to the catastrophic utility-caused wildfires of 2017 and 2018. So the Wildfire Fund was created through Assembly Bill 1054 that was passed and signed by the governor in July of 2019. And one thing I want to acknowledge before I even get into the specifics of the fund is that the fund actually has three key regulatory bodies that manage some aspect of this fund. So our office is the one that issues the safety certifications that play a key role in this wildfire fund. So that I'll explain in a little bit. The California Catastrophe Response Council is the actual body that administers the fund and manages the utilities' request to access the fund. And that body lives within our California Earthquake Authority. And then the California Public Utilities Commission obviously plays a critical role in the consideration of if a utility leverages the fund, what responsibility do or do they not have in terms of payment back to that fund. So I just want to acknowledge those two other entities because some of the stuff that I talk about today will be pieces that they actually manage. But I'll give you an overview of the framework of the fund. So first and foremost, the fund, like I said, was the legislation passed in 2019. And basically utilities, investor-owned utilities in California had to decide whether they wanted to participate in this fund by June 30th of 2020. So there was a timeline on access to or choice to participate in the fund. If they chose to participate, and we have three utilities in California that chose to participate in the fund, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. Those utilities then contributed to the fund to build up the fund, which is roughly $21 billion. Then that fund is, like I said, is administered by the California Catastrophe Response Council, and utilities can access it if they have a covered wildfire. So the fund does define what type of wildfire they would have access to. First and foremost, the wildfire had to be determined that they were the cause of the wildfire, and it had to have happened after a certain date, after July 12th, I believe, 2019. So it did not cover fires prior to the creation of the fund. Then also there would have to be a certain amount of costs that the utility had to bear in terms of wildfire costs to a wildfire that they had been determined that they were the cause of, up to $1 billion. And so far, the California Catastrophe Response Council, they've been monitoring sort of what wildfires that have happened since that time potentially would be wildfires that would have utilities access this fund. And there have been two so far. The Kincaid fire in 2019, October of 2019, that was a fire that was deemed to have been caused by a transmission line failure of PG&E. And then also the Dixie fire, which was in July of 2021, that was deemed to have been caused by a distribution line in PG&E's territory as well. So to date, PG&E has begun the process of applying for the wildfire fund for the Dixie fire, but it's just in the beginning phases, so it's not been all executed yet. But that fire is being considered. The Kincaid fire, as far as I'm aware, they have not submitted to start that process for. But what does the wildfire fund do? So the safety certification, what the wildfire fund does is it gives the utility access. It basically acts as a secondary insurance, if you will, to pay wildfire claims. The utility can access those funds to pay claims once they've utilized all the other resources that they have to be able to do that. Then if they've used the wildfire fund, if they have a safety certification, and this is the piece that my department, the Office of Energy and Infrastructure Safety, owns in this process. If the utility has a safety certification, it changes the burden of proof that they have for being deemed to have acted reasonably, just and reasonable in their consideration at the PUC for whether or not they have to pay back or how much they have to pay back that fund. So that's where the safety certification comes in. So now I'll talk a little bit about what's required in that safety certification. So what we administer is the safety certification. The safety certification, again, a utility can choose to request one. And I want to separate out choosing to participate in the fund is separate from choosing to request a safety certification, but they do have a relationship. So we have 3 utilities that have participated in the wildfire fund. We have 4 utilities that have requested safety certification. The 3 that have participated in the fund, PG&E, Edison, and San Diego. And then we also have Bear Valley Electric, which is a small investor-owned utility up in the mountains above LA. They have also requested a safety certification through our office. It does not have the same relevance to the wildfire fund, though, because they have not participated in the wildfire fund. To get a safety certification, there are 7 elements, 7 criteria that each investor-owned utility must have to get that safety certification. First and foremost, they must have an approved wildfire mitigation plan. That wildfire mitigation plan approval also comes from our office. They have to be in good standing, and good standing can be met by agreeing to implement recommendations from their most recent safety culture assessment. We do safety culture assessments on an annual basis from a statutory perspective. At each of the investor-owned utilities, we make recommendations through that assessment. If the 3 utilities that participate in the fund choose to agree to implement those recommendations, they meet that good standing. So all 4 of the utilities that request safety certifications always agree to implement the recommendations from that safety culture assessment to meet that good standing. The third criteria is that the board of directors for that utility must have a safety committee made up of safety experts, and they actually submit to us as part of the safety certification application the resumes of those experts, and we get to assess if it meets that. The board of directors also has to have a reporting relationship on safety to both the commission, the Public Utilities Commission, and to the Director of Energy Safety, currently me, on an annual basis. So basically, and we just had those for the 4 utilities this year, a few weeks ago at the end of August and early September. And that's an opportunity for us, the Commission and Energy Safety, to hear from the board of directors and senior level executives within the utility on how they are doing on all of their safety initiatives and safety culture, both wildfire and writ large across their organization. So that's the 4th criteria. The 5th criteria is exec comp, and there's 2 elements to exec comp, so it's really 5 and 6. And this is a really key one, so I'll go into a little bit more detail. The utility has to have an approved executive compensation structure from our office. And that is, the approval is driven by statutory requirements that it's also part of 1054, that the utility has to have safety performance metrics incorporated into their exec comp structures for their executive officers. So the key elements there being that they have performance metrics that are measurable and enforceable, and that it may include tying 100% of that incentive compensation package to safety performance at the utility. And several of our utilities have actually, over the course of the last 5 years, leveraged that particular element of their safety compensation structure to not compensate executives if they've had a catastrophic fire, usually if it's been involved with fatalities. The second element of exec comp is for new and amended compensation contracts with new executives that come in, there need to be strict limits on guaranteed cash compensation, and a primary portion of the officer's compensation has to be based on the achievement of objective performance metrics, including safety performance metrics. So there are some key elements there that, again, that are prescribed in statute that really ensure that the executive's decision-making and compensation is tied to improved investments in safety investments and in safety performance improvement. And then last but not least, the seventh criteria for the safety certification is they have to show that they are implementing their most currently approved wildfire mitigation plan. So what does this whole this framework do? The key here is that it's driving and incentivizing executive focus on improved safety performance through proactive investments in safety. And we have seen in California, because this has been around for about 5 years now, we have seen a shift within the organizations around organizational structure, positions, and executive board awareness and investment in safety incentives since the passage of 1054. I'll leave it there to pass on to the other panelists, but happy to answer the questions when we get to the question and answer period.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. And so we'll turn now to Michael Wara. Please go ahead. And I believe you're muted, I'm sorry.
I apologize. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be speaking to so many of the commissioners from around the country this morning. I'm going to just describe briefly a proposal that we released in the form of a working paper at the Brookings Institution earlier this year that attempts to adopt many of the lessons that we've taken from the creation of the Wildfire Fund in California that Caroline just ably described, and to develop a model that could work both that could take that basic approach and apply it to utilities wherever there is wildfire risk, significant wildfire risk within a service territory, and also adapt the model so that it is functional for utilities that are smaller than the 3 large investor-owned utilities in California. As Caroline mentioned, only the 3 large investor-owned utilities in California opted to join the Wildfire Fund when it was created. They did so for very important reasons. They needed, in particular, PG&E needed a pathway out of bankruptcy, and Edison and San Diego were facing very concrete and direct threats to their investment-grade credit ratings due to wildfire risk. And what the whole structure of the Wildfire Fund system and the safety assessment system in California has done is really 2 things. One is to dramatically improve the safety and operational safety of utilities in California. And I would put that first, because I think no one who works in this business wants to see the companies they work for or the companies they regulate be the cause of fires that kill people and destroy communities. So safety comes first in my book, and I think it's an enormous credit to the work of the entire staff at OEIS and within the utilities for the steps that we've made over the last 5 years. I sleep better at night in the fall weather that we've been enjoying the last week or so, knowing that that work has been done. So safety, improve safety, and also create a sense of comfort on the part of financial markets that stocks that return a reasonable dividend or debt that is priced to be low risk will not be in serious difficulty after low probability, high consequence fire on a fall afternoon, or even a December 31st, or whenever that may occur. And so the 2 things go together. We need to reduce risk, and then we also need to create an insurance construct that allows utilities to function in financial markets and play the role that they do play of being a low-cost source of finance to construct long-lived infrastructure. What we have observed and this really started with conversations in California with municipal utilities in California that are really struggling with this issue, and also discussions in Oregon, both with the investor owns and with the rural electric cooperatives. is that a number of utilities are struggling with this problem. Of course, it was made more acute after the decisions in Oregon with respect to gross negligence on the part of Pacificorp. And so we developed a proposal, which I would invite you all to take a look at. It's on the Brookings website, that lays out a federal approach. And the reason we propose a federal approach rather than a state-by-state approach in this area is that we believe that California is somewhat unique in its the number of ratepayers within the state and the ability to marshal very large financial resources via reasonable charges to those ratepayers and the utilities. The proposal would implement a quite simplified safety certification process for all utilities that voluntarily participate in the process. And that really mimics a lot of what energy safety has done in certain respects, but not others. We recognize that not all utilities are going to be willing, have the political support or the financial wherewithal to do some of the things that California utilities have done and are doing. And so we propose kind of a minimum, a lowest common denominator approach to safety that we believe would dramatically reduce risk during high fire danger weather. And then pair that with a more flexible approach to the insurance side of the equation, which would evaluate both the buy-in, essentially the financial wherewithal of a utility to contribute to a fund, and also have a variable attachment point, essentially a varying deductible. In California, the large investor-owned utilities are responsible for the first $1 billion of losses associated with wildfire that they cause, and then the wildfire fund kicks in. We believe that many utilities would struggle to afford a $1 billion deductible, and particularly smaller rural electrics and municipals in many parts of the West. So we propose that a metric be developed to essentially create a sliding scale for where that deductible would sit based on load and customers served. We don't try to specify in the paper too much detail on this, and that really comes from my own personal experience in negotiating the language. I was a consultant to the Senate Pro Tem in California in the process of negotiating AB 1054, and that experience firmly, left me with a firm belief that a lot of these decisions really need to be negotiated by the stakeholders that will ultimately be accountable for the functioning of the system. We do point out, that the Price-Anderson Act may be a good model for how to think about this problem, that there should be a layer of, utility retained risk to create strong incentives. There should be a layer of pooled risk amongst all the utilities that are participating in the fund. And then ultimately, there should be a layer for the most catastrophic outcomes where the federal government steps in to support the continued provision of electric service across the country in the face of worsening wildfire conditions. And the federal government does play an important role in moderating those conditions in the sense that the Forest Service, is the preeminent wildfire response across much of the West, and also has an important role to play in reducing risk via fuel treatment and prescribed fire. So I would say that we lay out the basic architecture, but there's a lot of detail that would need to be filled in. We also attempt in this work to be respectful of the traditional distinction between state and federal jurisdiction over utilities. We recognize that this is an intrusion into state responsibility. That's why participation in the program we think should be voluntary and not mandatory. And we also attempt to respect differences between utility territories and what they're willing to spend on this problem. California utilities have been willing to spend very large sums sometimes approaching $10 billion per year across the three investor-owned utilities. And we think that's probably not realistic for many jurisdictions. And so we describe a sort of stripped-down program that would be, we think, is feasible for many utilities, and that could dramatically improve safety, but that does come with important trade-offs. One of the trade-offs that probably people in many jurisdictions are experiencing now is just the reduced reliability that's associated with some wildfire mitigation strategies. And the real question, we think, is how much are utilities willing to spend to mitigate that reliability impact, given the need to provide safe service? That the safety should not be compromised, reliability should. And then there's a question about the political willingness to pay for getting back to the reliability that existed prior to the heightened wildfire risk. I'm happy to take questions about the proposal, and thank you very much for including me in this conversation.
Thank you, Michael. And while you were speaking, we did have a request for a link to the study, to the paper, and it's been posted in the chat. So thank you, Jody, for doing that. Okay, and now we're going to turn to Riaz Mohammed to give us a little perspective on the Electric Sector Coordinating Council and other work that's being done. He has a few slides that we'll share. So take it away, Riaz.
Thank you, Commissioner Randall, and thank you, NARUC, not only for inviting me to present on this third roundtable, but for holding the roundtable series in general. I think, speaking to some of my peers, this has been a very educational roundtable, and I'm glad that'll be continued at the November NARUC meeting. So I just wanted to pick up on something that Michael just mentioned in his presentation. It's really about that kind of partnership and holistic approach to mitigating wildfire risk. Electric utility companies definitely play a key role in mitigating wildfire risk, but they're not the only stakeholder that has an impact on this. And what I was going to highlight just in these few minutes that I have to kick it off is the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, or we call it ESCC for short, it's really a forum where senior leaders from the electric companies, so the CEOs, and senior leaders from government come together to address threats to the electric grid. That could be cyber threats, physical threats, or really extreme weather. And I think, they're definitely practicing that right now with the hurricanes down in Florida. If you just go to the next slide. So the genesis of the ESCC really happened in 2013 after Superstorm Sandy. For those that were in this industry around then, there's a little bit of kind of not as best, the coordination wasn't as good as it could have been during that process. So out of that, they identified kind of 15 critical infrastructure sectors, and they identified a government lead for each one. If you go down to the bottom of the first column, you can see that for the energy sector, DOE is really kind of the sector specific lead. And as that, they bring together other federal agencies to address whatever the threat is. So historically, it focused on things like cyber, physical, hurricanes, but in 2020, if you just want to go to the next slide, kind of recognizing the impact that wildfires have, not only kind of, to infrastructure, land, and others, they formed the ESCC Wildfire Working Group. And you can see there kind of who the leads are from the different respective parts of the industry. But what DOE did is it brought in the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, federal agencies that historically hadn't been involved in the ESCC to work on kind of three broad categories around wildfires. It's mitigation, detection, and response and recovery. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about, Michael mentioned the U.S. Forest Service as kind of a key player in the ESCC or in the wildfire risk. And one of the things that we're working on is trying to really kind of make the permitting process more efficient around allowing electric companies to mitigate vegetation around their infrastructure. We know vegetation is a kind of big driver of wildfire risk. So originating in California, the Forest Service there implemented something called a master special use permit, which basically, really makes the process of getting approvals to remove vegetation and harden the system more efficient. So that started in California. Xcel, the company I work for, we got ours shortly after that. And in 2023, working with the Forest Service, 6 additional master special use permits were completed, and they're on pace to complete additional in 2024. I would say when this group started, they really focused on right-of-way management and land management with the Forest Service and BLM. I will say about 18 months ago, or a little bit around there, with the fires in Maui, and then other fires kind of across not only California, but other parts of the country, it's really started to look at issues around what we mentioned earlier, which is the financial viability of electric companies and their importance to, clean energy goals, national security, economic security, and what those impacts are having more broadly. So I think this is a good example of, partnerships to address the wildfire risk. There are others, obviously NARUC is a key stakeholder as well, but really just working collectively and holistically to address this risk. So I will turn it back to Commissioner Rondell and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Riaz. Appreciate that. And I've had the opportunity to participate in a few of those calls, and it's been really interesting to hear the consumer-owned utilities, both the cooperatives and the municipal utilities and the investor-owned utilities, all really working towards the same goal. And at NARUC, we mostly deal with investor-owned utilities, but I think understanding the impact on the municipals and the small consumer-owned utilities is really critical. So thank you all three for your thoughts on these important issues. And I'm going to turn this over now to Commissioner Fay and Commissioner Tani, who are going to have some questions for our panelists. But if you do have questions as we're going along, please put them in the chat, and Commissioner Tani and Commissioner Fay can call on you, or if you want to raise your hand, I guess that's also an option. But please take it away, Commissioner Tani and Commissioner Fay. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I think I'll just jump in, Commissioner Fay, if that's all right with you.
Go ahead.
Caroline, I'm sitting here and watch duty on my phone is blowing up with a fire about 4.5 miles from my dad's place down there in the Sierras. It's been a really active fire season in California and in Oregon. And I'm curious if you're seeing any reduction in the utility ignitions or severity coming out of the utility mitigation efforts. Sort of is there proof in the pudding for the safety certification that you're seeing on the ground, even while the risk is, expanding? We still have extreme fire danger in a lot of the West, even now in the middle of October.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately what it all comes down to. So the short answer is we are seeing trends in the right direction. But the question is, what are we measuring? And I also just want to be really clear that at the end of the day, the risk is increasing. So we certainly have not crested the mountain, if you will. But what are the trends that we're seeing? So those performance metrics that I mentioned in terms of what we require the utilities and the executives to have, we also require the utilities to have performance metrics in their wildfire mitigation plans. And the key ones that we're monitoring are total ignitions, also normalized ignitions, because we all know that total ignitions may go up or down depending on the threat because of weather, as well as outcome metrics. How much acreage was burned, what critical infrastructure and the value of assets that were potentially destroyed, and fatalities. So those are sort of the 5 key metrics that I look at writ large. Are we going in the right direction? And the good news is across all of those, we are trending in the right direction. There on an individual year-over-year basis, there can be ups and downs, but we've now been in existence for long enough that we can look at multi-year averages. So we look at the 6-year average, and if you compare the 6-year average of 17 to 22 to individual years of 23 and 24, 24 is obviously not done yet, but just what we're currently trend at, for example, at PG&E, we're seeing, roughly a 50% reduction. I think it's 47% specifically reduction in this year's total ignitions for equipment failures over their 6-year average. We're seeing a 57%, almost 60% reduction in a vegetation-caused outage or ignitions. Again, individual years over the 6-year average. I want to be really clear that it only takes one ignition to potentially have a catastrophic fire. So I would say that there's still heightened risk and we can't take our eye off the ball. But are we seeing things move in the right direction? Absolutely. We also are seeing across the board reductions in acreage, reduction in critical infrastructure assets and property damage, and reduction in fatalities. I think it's really important, though, that we're very clear that it only takes one. And what we're ultimately shooting for is a reduction in overall ignitions and elimination of catastrophic. And that's how we approach evaluating the wildfire mitigation plans. Are the utilities building capabilities within their organization, layers of protection, if you will, so that they can catch those ignitions, reduce the number of sparks to create ignitions, but of the ignitions that happen, figure out how to catch those ignitions before they turn catastrophic. The last major catastrophic one that we know was caused by a utility was Dixie Fire in 21. So it's not that long ago. I wouldn't want to say that we've conquered that yet. But are we moving in the right direction? Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, and I'll jump to Michael real quick. I know you put in the chat there, Michael, that you're available, you and your team are available to meet with commissioners and staff for more detail on the proposal. So I appreciate that. I just want to talk a little bit about, I guess, the proposal itself, why a federal solution is necessary. And then maybe you could just address sort of the concept of, is this essentially a bailout? I mean, for the utilities, like, why would this be an appropriate solution?
Sure. So on the need for a federal solution, I think it is possible that we could imagine the utility industry collectively banding together, but the key need is scale. Investors need to be confident that after a major catastrophic loss, a utility will not to which recourse might happen because of the reality of the litigation, that the utility will not be bankrupt. And I think there are important reasons to think that utilities, there are some states where utilities have sufficient scale, sufficient numbers of customers where they could potentially create an individual state could create a system. But I think when you look across most of the areas where there's high risk, there just aren't enough customers and enough load to really make something work that can withstand even a moderately sized catastrophic fire where you get house-to-house ignitions and a large loss during the first burn period. Is this a bailout? That's a question we get a lot in California, and I think it's worth reflecting on the Kincaid fire, which Caroline briefly mentioned. Usually when companies go bankrupt because they are committing torts, they stop committing the torts in bankruptcy, right? So when the pharmaceutical industry was being sued successfully because of prescriptions of pain medications, they stopped doing the thing that was causing the harm. The thing is that utilities do not have that luxury, right? We depend on utility service as a core, an essential good that without which society will struggle to function. And so utilities, when confronted with this rapidly changing risk and the challenge to their traditional operational practices, don't have the option to stop committing the tort, right? Operating their systems in high risk areas just because the risks have changed and there is a potential, company ending litigation risk. So I think we do need to provide some kind of a backstop that allows them to continue to operate, while at the same time forcing or requiring changes that really reduce and mitigate their risk. And so it's that combination. I would not be supportive of just providing insurance to utilities. I think that is not the right approach. The utilities need to have skin in the game. They need to have risk that they retain to create incentives. And we also need to have some requirements that make sure that utilities that are participating in an insurance pooling mechanism are meeting some minimum safety standards. With those two caveats, I think this is not a bailout. It's a recognition that utilities are not normal companies.
Great. Yeah. And just one quick follow-up on that. I mean, do you see there basically be a need for the distinction, to your point, between the larger customer base that can maybe absorb it in a smaller base that doesn't? Is that separation relevant? Is it going to take two different scenarios to resolve this, or do you think it could all be kind of under one roof?
I guess one could imagine something that is, you could imagine two systems, I suppose, but I think there is real value in pooling the risk, right? In trying to raise the level of safety for everyone and help everyone achieve a level of safety where their communities are genuinely safer during dry weather, high wind events. And also, facilitating the participation, because the thing that we observe now is that, the rural electrics and munis serve large parts of the West where there is significant fire risk. And that's a municipal bankruptcy waiting to happen. And in some cases, maybe happening. And I think we have an interest, I guess, personally, I believe that we should support all parts of the West and not just the places where, urbanized cores create a customer base that's large enough to support this kind of pooling mechanism. And, in the context where California was in 2019, we kind of had to move very quickly. We had literally a deadline from the credit rating agencies about action. And then when they said action, they were like a bill enacted into law. And so we had to move very quickly. And we didn't have the kind of time to think about the rural parts of California, but they are in trouble today. They struggle to take advantage of, the various incentives that have been created by the Biden administration to build infrastructure because they have trouble accessing finance. We need to build more transmission. We need to be able to finance that transmission with debt and equity. And I think an increasing number of utilities are going to struggle to do that if we don't manage this risk for them. And I guess my view would be that outside of a few, multi-state holding companies, individual utilities will struggle, individual states will struggle. And so there does need to be at least a regional solution. One thing we haven't talked about is, our team is updating the sort of our risk assessment and mitigation maturity work for investor-owned utilities. And we're expanding to the Midwest and the Southeast because this is not just a Western problem. It's right now perceived to be one, but it used to be perceived to be a Southern California problem, and then it was just a California problem, and then it was just a Oregon and California problem. And I think we really need to be open-eyed about the possible catastrophic outcomes that are becoming more likely as the weather changes and climate changes, and just I would like to see us get ahead of that problem rather than be reactive as it spreads to other states. And so I do think this is a national problem. In the Southeast, in particular, there's a very different fire culture where prescribed fire is used much more actively, and that really reduces risk in certain places. I wish we had more of that here in California. We're working on it. But this is a problem that can occur in different ways in many places in the country that are not traditionally thought of as high-risk areas. New Jersey would be one that I would include. So I do think there is a reason to create an option, again, voluntary, right? Utilities can decide what is in their interest. Their bondholders and shareholders probably will have a view about that. But to create the option of a backstop makes sense from a public interest perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think your point's well taken. All of this is exceeding beyond the normal boundaries. I mean, we're just starting to see the expansion of it, and it's not just a single state issue. And although we have different issues, we're facing a hurricane barreling down on us. I mean, some of the, I think, discussion can be similar. I'm surprised sometimes how similar some of the components can be for these catastrophes. So I appreciate you going beyond just the California mentality and thinking, maybe what model would be optional for other folks. Thanks, Commissioner Tani. Let me kick it back to you.
Thanks so much. And I see Commissioner Harvey's got a question in the chat. So Michael, maybe you can give that a look while I ask Riaz. We talk a lot about coordination in our sector, and then we throw a lot of acronyms around, and it's very hard. And I wonder what the key issues we should be considering about the obstacles to coordinating, particularly around right-of-way permitting on federal lands. How can we as regulators help? Is there anything we can do to help unlock that log jam, especially in the West, where they are such a major landholder and hold a lot of the risk in terms of untreated lands?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Yeah, you know, being the biggest landowner out West, there is a lot of requirement for coordination. I know one of the things that the ESCC has been working on is shared stewardship agreements for managing landscapes in a wildfire resilient manner. That's something that definitely, I think, both from the Forest Service side and the state side, there has been increased interest in doing those types of agreements. In terms of like, you know, the biggest obstacles or hurdles on the federal permitting side, I think one of the things is just kind of is just, you know, inconsistent application of the regulations between offices. I think, you know, for a company like Xcel and others in the West that are multi-jurisdictional, even within the same state, you know, going from one office to another, not necessarily the same requirements. So just that consistency office to office. And the other is really just, you know, for federal permitting, sometimes you require multiple agencies to be part of the review process, and finding ways to make that more efficient so that each time a permit goes to a new federal agency, there isn't, you know, kind of re-looking at information that's already been submitted. Lastly, I'd say staffing. I think, you know, whether at the state or the federal level, staffing is still an issue that many folks are facing. And, you know, as we look to build additional infrastructure, harden the infrastructure we have, you know, it's just going to be a bigger pull on the staffing resources to get that work done. I will say, you know, I don't know how many of the folks on here participate in WGA, but at their last meeting in June, as part of the disaster resolution, they talked about, you know, the financial impact of wildfire and some of the land management policies. So just using your voice as state regulators to engage federal policymakers, whether it be Congress or others, to just highlight the importance of the work that proper land management, vegetation management play in reducing wildfire risk, not just for the right-of-way itself, but as part of a larger approach to mitigating wildfire risk.
I appreciate that. I think one of the challenges, and Caroline's highlighted this, is you can get after the ignition. There is what the utility can do about the consequences of that ignition is very much out of their hands. And there's some pieces they can work, but it's on the land manager to be reducing that risk, and that requires that cooperation. So thanks for that. Commissioner Fay, should we just ask Michael to answer Commissioner Harvey's question from Utah? I can read it out if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead, Commissioner Klein.
Well, I think I always appreciate Commissioner Harvey's economics and incentives background. He asks very to the point questions, which I always appreciate in our Western dialogues. In looking across many different Western states, the liability standards by state statute are very different. And so it's harder or easier to bankrupt a utility depending on what state you're in theory at least. And does that reality make federal cooperation more difficult? Or Michael, is this where you're thinking this opt-in voluntary approach a state could decide? It's not worth it to us. We've managed this risk ourselves. The value proposition isn't there for what we would have to contribute. How do you think about that difference in tort structure in states?
Sure. So first of all, I think the situation is dynamic. You know, prior to the decision in the Pacific Core case concerning gross negligence, I think many people assumed, well, California is just crazy with its liability provisions, and we have inverse condemnation here, and nobody else does, and it's fine. I think, well, I'll just say, like, I was one of the people saying, I think that the California utilities are changing the standard of care, and that is going to ultimately be recognized in other states. And that was, in fact, kind of what happened in Oregon. It also, I think there was well, anyway, I won't get into the Oregon case. Of course, Utah has taken action to really restrict the ability of plaintiffs to recover punitives in the aftermath of a fire, but not economic damages. And that may, that does change the equation. I think, I guess my perspective would be that any utility that meets, and this actually gets to something that Caroline mentioned, that Bear Valley is trying to get a safety certificate, even though they are not a part of the wildfire fund. Why would that be? I think the reason is that they want to be able to walk into court, if they ever have to walk into court, and say, look here, OEIS looked at what we're doing and they certified it. That doesn't mean we're perfect. That means we are on a trajectory of continuous improvement toward wildfire safety, right? And I think having that federal regulatory stamp could be extremely valuable in any litigation regarding economic damages. And frankly, I would hope that utilities, and I think they are, and our research is showing this, that utilities are moving very quickly to take action to try to do at least the first steps, right? Get situational awareness, have a plan when there is dangerous weather, so that they will not be held in future to have been grossly negligent, to have been, reckless. And I think we should strive for that. We should hold our utilities to that standard. They should not be reckless. They should exercise a reasonable duty of care. I am doubtful that any state is going to limit liability of utilities for simple negligence. I think that would face enormous resistance, and for liability for economic damages associated with negligence. That could happen. I'll be the first to say I can't predict the future with a crystal ball, but so far we haven't seen that. And I guess my assumption would be that the gross negligence outcome is a real outlier, and some states are taking action, like Utah, to actively limit that. But the better way, the better path, is to make sure that the utilities are doing the right things, that they are certified, that someone is watching to make sure that they have done the right things, so that they cannot be held by a jury to have been grossly negligent. And the idea here would be to create that incentive. It's certainly possible that some utilities might not want to participate. This is where the details really matter. What is the buy-in? How much do shareholders have to contribute? Shareholders in California contributed vast sums to the wildfire fund. It's a 50-50 split, $10.5 billion from shareholders, $10.5 billion from ratepayers. Shareholders may be unwilling in other states if they perceive the risk as low. And so there'll be a real question as the details of this, if it comes to that, are ironed out, about how to balance the cost of participation with the benefits of participation. And I think that's something that would have to be worked out in a negotiation. And certainly liability rules will play into that.
I'll just add into that in terms of the safety certification that Michael mentioned. So he's absolutely right. Bear Valley is not part of the fund. So there are other reasons that they've requested that. I don't want to speak for them, but I am certainly aware that both capital funders through Wall Street and stuff, they're aware of the safety certification and what that means. So I know they ask questions. Insurance companies also ask questions about it. And we do have another utility that is considering requesting the safety certification, again, regardless of their access to the fund, because the fund was a one-time deal.
And can I just clarify, since I've got two experts here, the sort of financial streets that PG&E found itself in were really not about punitive damages. They were just the straight up economic damages. It's different than Pacific Core and the Oregon case, where it's the punitive damages that are really piling up. In California, the scale of just straight up economic damages is my sense what pushed PG&E sort of over the edge. It wasn't even this sort of piling up of punitive. Is that an accurate understanding?
That's accurate.
Okay, thanks. Because I think sometimes we get really lost in which damages under which regime. And the fact of the matter is, in the first 24 hours, these fires blow up in such a way. Once they're an urban conflagration, the scale of even just the property damage is really daunting. Yeah.
Could I just jump in and add one point to something that was discussed earlier in the earlier question about the Forest Service? and sort of the need to support permitting and mitigation, I would just, I'm not sure about the folks on this call, but they should understand, if you don't know, you should know, if the Forest Service is important to consequence of wildfire where you regulate, that the Forest Service currently has a $750 million deficit. They are laying off all non-fire seasonal employees. So anybody who would be doing the permitting work, right, to allow a utility to do maintenance in a right of way, those people are in serious jeopardy. And there are deep structural budget issues with the Forest Service where I think NARUC coming to and speaking with a unified voice that this is important, and important not just for timber management, but also for the safety of communities and reliable and cost-effective electric service could be important. I wouldn't presume to say what that position statement should be or how it should be structured, but for those of you that don't know, right, the Forest Service is in a crisis right now, and it's not clear what the way is out of that crisis, and it's going to have impacts on any utility operations and maintenance that's occurring on federal land.
Well, it goes to this challenge of in California, you're seeing $9 or $10 billion a year on mitigating one set of ignitions, and a guy still pushes a car. You know, it doesn't change the fire risk. It doesn't change the fire risk on the landscape. And that just, it feels like if we spent $9 billion on the fire risk, not on the ignition, what we could get out of it. But of course, we have to operate safe utilities. Caroline.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one because and this comes up a lot where and agreed, there's been a lot of money spent on the wildfire mitigation plans. There are follow-on benefits of that investment that go beyond wildfire that I think are really important to understand and capture, because I think it's easy to like kind of silo it of under wildfire. So just a few examples. We are also, you know, the utilities are self-reporting. I don't have the data to back it up, but the utilities are reporting that when it comes to storm resiliency, right? The hardened infrastructure, the increased capacity in terms of addressing outages, all of that is also going to the benefit of being able to, you know, quickly respond to and quickly recover from storm outages. There are other investments that I think are going to be beneficial long-term for the clean energy transition and load growth. So for example, as they're hardening infrastructure and they're upgrading their transformers to be able to have larger capacity, that's getting ready, right, for additional load in those areas. So I do just want to make sure that it's understood that it's not solely purely just wildfire benefit. There is a broader benefit with some of the other capabilities that wildfire instigated the investment in.
So
yeah, and we've done a lot of hardening in Florida, to your point, Caroline, and it's the same kind of thing. You do get these additional benefits of even just smaller storms or customer appreciation for, you know, minimized outages on transmission lines, and it does go beyond the primary purpose, I guess, what you're spending on. Commissioner Randall, I know we're getting close to 2, so I want to make sure we stay on schedule.
Yep, we're at the top of the hour, and I know, Michael Wara, you have to head out. So thanks to all the panelists, a tremendous conversation, really appreciate it. And so thank you, all of you who've participated. We really appreciate the panelists for their presentations and sharing their expertise. And Caroline, as your agency is an associate member of NARUC, you're welcome to stay with us for the next hour, but Michael and Riaz, you're now excused from the session, and we'll let you know if we have any follow-up questions. And I will let folks know that Michael Wara is a panelist for the at the NARUC annual meeting, the general session on wildfire, so he will be there. But now is the time that state commissioners and staff are going to join in a closed session to talk about what we've just heard today. And the session, this discussion session, is an opportunity for all state commissioners and staff, not just those from the West, to participate. So please stay on. If you're not from the West, we